In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth and tons more, and he made humans to rule over it, but he didn't make us slaves like other ancient Near East stories. Adam and Eve eventually ate from the tree, sinning for the first time ever. They try to hide from God after they sin, but they get caught and locked away. They eventually have Cain and Abel, and they grow up constantly sacrificing to God. But God, for some reason, favors Abel more. Cain gets jealous and wants to kill Abel. After sin sneaks into the party, everyone becomes evil, and God says, nah, they're gonna die and stuff. Except Noah. He's cool. So God tells Noah to build the ark, and Noah floats for 40 days and 40 nights. Usually, people in ancient Near East stories after a flood would have to feed God, or their God. But Noah doesn't have to, because God isn't like other gods. After the 40 days, Noah and his crew leave the ship, and Noah goes on to live his normal life. Eventually, though, Noah decides to sin. Some people come together and try to build the Tower of Babel for the gods to come down to Earth. Except they try to do it without God, so he makes a bunch of different languages. All the people flee and eventually fill the land. Cool thing was, God came down without the tower, and that's exactly what they built it for. God picked some random dude named Abraham to leave his home and lead a great nation, which will belong to God in Canaan. He has kids, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, and they become the foundation of Israel's beginnings. And Joseph brings the Israelites to settle in Egypt. And Joseph also becomes the second of command in Egypt. Way in the future, the Israelites get themselves into a sticky situation, which is slavery. Moses escapes by being raised by the princess. God reveals himself to Moses and calls him to lead Israel out of Egypt. Moses and Aaron try to show Pharaoh who's boss, and Pharaoh eventually lets the Israelites go. Moses miraculously splits the Red Sea, and they all cross through, but Pharaoh plots to chase after him. He and his army go chasing after him, but the waters close in. Israel gets led into the wilderness, but they become grumpy. God tells Moses to talk to a rock, but he hits it instead. There's still bread, and there's a bunch of quail that the Israelites can eat. They go to war, and they destroy them with God's power, which is in Moses' staff. Moses goes to Mount Sinai and gets the 10 Commandments. But the Israelites are like, yes, we should worship God through cows. But Moses gets angry and throws one of the 10 Commandments stones off the mountain and it breaks. Getting ready for war, God wants a census. He cleanses the sinful people in the camp as they get ready for war. The Levitical priests are dedicated to preach to the other 11 tribes, and they celebrate the second Passover and head away from Mount Sinai. They send 12 spies into the Promised Land, 1 from each tribe. 10 of them come back with bad news about giants and stuff, and God decides to not let them enter. Moses also gets brutally denied from entering the Promised Land because he slapped the rock instead of speaking to it. Aaron dies, and Israel decides to rebel. God sends serpents to kill the Israelites, but Israel is healed by looking at the bronze serpent. This is because the people that died from that didn't rely on God, which was the serpent. A prophet Balaam is hired to curse Israel, but it backfires and he blesses them instead because God made him do so. More laws are given about the Promised Land, and Israel prepares for an invasion. Joshua takes lead for Moses, and they send in the spies into the Promised Land. Rahab thankfully hides the spies for them, so they don't get caught. They celebrate the Passover, and manna stops appearing for them to eat. They also walk around the walls of Jericho, and that is eventually taken over after the walls fall. No one can loot it, and all pets, children, and people had to be killed. They also try to attack Ai, but lose because someone took something from Jericho. So God tells them to kill his family because they lost the war because of sin. The Israelites attack Ai again and win. The Israelites want to go to Hazor to meet the Gibeonites. They attack Hazor, and most of the promised land is now conquered. God instructs Joshua about the division of land, and the tribes receive land and more instructions about unconquered land. Joshua helps everyone renew their covenants with Israel and God before he dies. Israel gives the Canaanites eviction notices, but it fails and they become slaves to them. A new generation takes over, but they ignore God. The Israelites begin to worship Baal and lose battles because they are without God. Then a cycle starts. The Israelites sin, get enslaved, cry out to God, God sends a judge, Israel gets delivered, Israel serves the Lord. And that happens 6 times. Samson is the 6th judge, but he's a bad judge. He dies, and then Israel has no judges. Without a judge or a king, Israel has no guides, so they make their own rules on what is right and wrong. Everyone becomes evil and sinful and starts to kill each other. God chooses Samuel as a king, and the priests, Eli, and his wicked sons die. Samuel leads Israel to victory against the Philistines after the Ark of the Covenant is returned. Samuel guides Israel as a prophet, priest, and judge. Israel starts to riot and protest because they want a king like other nations. God gives the Israelites Saul, and Samuel appoints Saul as a king. Saul has the looks to be a king, but is a coward and doesn't listen to God. Saul fails to follow God and he gets cancelled. Samuel anoints David to replace Saul while he is still king. David was a good leader at this time, and he was brave enough to kill Goliath. Saul becomes jealous of David and thinks of a plan to get rid of him. Saul's attempts fail and he eventually dies. David becomes king and conquers Jerusalem and brings the Ark of the Covenant by dancing. David wants to build a temple for God, but God declines. God says, "I will build a house for David," and that's the Davidic covenant. David is lazy and stays home for war. While he's supposed to be gone, he sees Bathsheba. He demands for her to come over and commits adultery. He repents and sins and is forgiven. But David's family and his kingdom pay for the price of his sins. David reflects and thanks God for his deliverance. He also orders a sinful census, and he's punished for his choice and repents again. David appoints Solomon as king. Right before he dies, he gives Solomon a hit list for him to kill. Solomon builds a temple and asks for wisdom. He sins and ends as a foolish Solomon. Solomon dies and his son Rehoboam becomes king. Jeroboam rebels and forms the northern kingdom. There are 10 tribes in the north and 2 in the south, and Jerusalem and the temple are in the south. Southern Judah has a capital, Jerusalem, and has a temple. Northern Israel has a new capital, Samaria, and builds 2 calves at Dan and Bether for new worship centers. Prophet Elijah arises and challenges Baal worship in Israel. Elisha asks for a double portion from Elijah just before Elijah ascends to the heavens in a chariot of fire. With Elijah's power, Elisha performs many signs. Northern kingdom of Israel is bad, and they make bad decisions. The kings do evil in the eyes of God, and God sends a prophet to rebuke them. But the kings don't want to listen to prophets. God takes away his protection, and Assyria attacks Israel to take them over. 150 years later, many of the southern kings, not as many as the northern Israel, start doing evil in the eyes of God. God sends prophets again to rebuke the kings. Babylon attacks Judah and takes them into captivity. The king of Persia decrees 50,000 Israelites to return home. They return to Israel and rebuild the altar and temple. Zerubbabel rejects help from local Israelites because they aren't pure. The king of Persia decrees 2,000 more Israelites to return home. Ezra returns to bring spiritual renewal by reinstating the law of Moses. Ezra forces the true Israelites to divorce non-Israelite wives. The king of Persia decrees Nehemiah can return to rebuild Jerusalem's walls. Nehemiah returns and organizes the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls, but he faces opposition from the wall building from locals. Ezra and Nehemiah read Moses' law for 7 days and call people to a renewal of Mosaic covenant. Nehemiah tours the city and finds everyone to be unfaithful. He then prays to God to remember that he tried to call Israel to be faithful to the Mosaic law. The Noahic covenant is from Genesis 9, verse 8 through 17. It was made with Noah and all his descendants and every living creature. The covenant was unconditional, and the promise was that God would never flood the earth again. The sign of the promise is a rainbow. The Abrahamic covenant is from Genesis 12, verse 1 through 3, and that's the initial part, 15, verse 18 through 21, 17, verse 9 through 14. It was made with Abraham and all his descendants, and it was unconditional. God promises land, descendants, and blessing, and the sign of the covenant was circumcision. The Mosaic covenant is from Exodus 19 through 24. It was made with the people of Israel and their descendants. It was a conditional promise, and God promises to be Israel's God. Israel has to promise to be set apart, to be God's own possession, to be a kingdom of the priests, to be a holy nation. From this, God will bless them and the world through them if they keep the Mosaic covenant, but God will remove them from the promised land if they break the Mosaic covenant. The sign of the covenant is keeping the Sabbath. The Davidic covenant is from 2 Samuel 7, verse 4 through 16. It was an unconditional promise, and God promises David during his lifetime a great name, a permanent home, and a rest from his enemies. There were also promises to David after his life was over, a family dynasty, a father-son relationship, and an everlasting throne.